Welcome to Magic Arcanum. I'm Ryan Gomez. Behind the scenes is Nicole Letson, and we're so glad you're here because it's story time. The holidays are upon us, and what better time to talk about perhaps the most famous elf in all of Magic, Nissa. She was a big part of the Zendikar Rising story, but if you're new to the game, you might not be familiar with her history. So today, we're going to answer the question, who is Nissa? If you like the sound of that and you want to see this series cover your favorite character, please consider becoming a patron using the link down below. As always, we'll start with the basics. Nissa Ravane is an elven planeswalker from Zendikar. She is centered in green mana, although we have seen her use blue and black. Her first appearance was actually in the Duels of the Planeswalkers video game as an opponent you would face during challenges. Now, since then, she has gone through what we call a retcon, or retroactive continuity. That's when part of a character's history or origin is changed to better align with the story you're currently trying to tell. This has happened before in Magic a bit, and it also occurs in other properties like Star Wars and Marvel, so it's not a big deal. For the sake of accuracy, and because I don't need a dozen comments telling me I left it out, I will cover both her original origin and her new one. Version 1.0 gave us a Nissa with a fairly unremarkable childhood on Zendikar. She was a generic nature mage who believed elves were the most perfect species in the multiverse. And she found kinship in her early travels to Lorwyn, another plane full of elves who also believed that they were the chef's kiss of magic design. This is about where the retcon kicks in because Nissa was starting to exhibit what are effectively racist tendencies in a fantasy setting, and rather than let her run with that and become a villainous character, they decided to salvage what they could of her design and give her another shot. Which brings us to version 2.0 and the one that we'll be following for the rest of the video. Nissa's story still starts with her on Zendikar, but now she is plagued by nightmarish dreams because she is one of the plane's last animists, a special type of shaman who can communicate with plants, animals, and even the land itself. So this already gives us a much more interesting origin as Nissa's character traits are more focused, and that's going to lead to a better adventure story than we would have gotten with elves rule, vampires drool. Anyway, Nissa followed the visions in her dream to one of the mountains of Zendikar, which just so happened to be the lithoform prison of the Eldrazi, as built by Nahiri long before Nissa was ever born. Nissa realized her visions were Zendikar itself trying to communicate with her. The plane was suffering from the presence of the Eldrazi, contained as they may be. So, with a bit of youthful optimism, Nissa thought she could help. Without really understanding the forces at play, she attempted to obliterate the darkness within the mountain, and boy oh boy did that not work. Her confrontation with the Eldrazi ignited her spark and set her down the path of becoming both arguably the ruiner and then savior of her own home, but we're not there yet. Let's pause for a moment and look closer at her first two cards, because they really show the difference between her revised origins. First, there's Nissa Ravane. She cares about elves. She can pull a specific creature card out of your deck, and there's only one other planeswalker who can do that, and it's from an intro deck. And her ultimate can pull every elf out of your deck and put them onto the battlefield. Which really illustrates her whole elves are the best and I can prove it line of thinking. So compare that to Nissa Worldwaker, which came about 5 years later. Gone are the references to elves, and in their place are abilities to animate lands, untap lands, and pull lands out of your deck. It's this version of Nissa that serves as the template for all of her following cards, which we will now see as we resume her story. After exploring the multiverse a bit, Nissa returned to Zendikar and tried to find a quiet place to settle down, but that proved hard to do with the Eldrazi starting to slip out of their containment. The timely arrival of Soren Markov offered a way for Nissa to fix the problem, so she teamed up with him, and together they headed to a place on Zendikar called the Eye of Ugin. This was the control point of the Hedron network that was keeping the larger Eldrazi in stasis, but it had become weakened to the point where smaller ones could already escape. Soren asked Nissa to help reinforce the magic holding everything together, but Nissa, bless her pointy-eared heart, instead shattered the main Hedron and broke the bonds holding the Eldrazi. Remember, she believed that the very presence of the Eldrazi, contained as they were, was causing her beloved Zendikar pain. So her plan was to release the Eldrazi and then hope that they flee the plane, which I gotta admit would probably work on most regular prisoners, right? You uncuff them and they tend to run for it. They don't usually stand around in the jail wondering what the warden has in mind for lunch. But the Eldrazi are unlike anything else, and their behavior does not always make sense to you and me. So they stuck around and started eating Zendikar, as is their nature. You know who did leave, though? Soren. Realizing the plane was lost, he returned to Innistrad, probably hoping to live a long and boring life before the Eldrazi caught up to him and devoured his home. Anyway, the next card for Nissa in order of release would be her one from Magic Origins, which shows her as a legendary creature who then flips into a planeswalker. This is supposed to represent her spark igniting after discovering the Eldrazi on Zendikar. But for me, the most interesting part of this card is her ability to create a creature token for Ashaya. Ashaya is a special elemental, and she has her own full card now, but at this point in Nissa's history, her connection to the living spirit of Zendikar, the awoken world, as it were, is only captured on this token. Oh, and a fun bit of trivia. World Waker is Shaya in one of the languages of Zendikar. So Ashaya literally is the awoken world, which connects her linguistically to Nissa's card from M15. Nissa got one other fun toy in Magic Origins, and that is her sword, the Sword of the Animist. It is a thin, sharp blade concealed within a staff, and I think that sets her apart from the traditional bow-wielding elven hero characters. Where were we? Oh yes, Zendikar was being ravaged by the Eldrazi, and lucky for Nissa, help is starting to arrive. Gideon and Jace, and a little while later, Chandra all come to the plane and mount a defense against the Eldrazi. This is the formation of the Gatewatch, which I cover in other videos. So for today, I just want to focus on the relationship between two of its members, which starts here on Zendikar. To defeat the Eldrazi, the plan calls for Nissa to tap into the plane's ley lines and channel their mana into Chandra, who will use it to supercharge her own pyromancy. This connects those two characters in a very intimate way. It's the type of connection that can only happen in fantasy and science fiction settings, where things like magic and drift-compatible brainwaves are a thing. On top of that, we add the emotional thrill of saving a whole world full of people and magnify it through this magical connection. We now have the recipe for a bond that should be nearly unbreakable. You hear me, Kelman? I said nearly unbreakable. Anyway, Nissa's card at this point in the story is Voice of Zendikar, which shows her perched atop Ashaya. Now, while 3-mana Planeswalker cards are often format defining, this one didn't really capture what Nissa was capable of. Her best version is still several years away, in fact. But it's always darkest before dawn, which lines up perfectly with the Gatewatch heading into their next adventure in Shadows over Innistrad. Nissa doesn't get a card here, but she was present for the later part of the story when it was revealed Emrakul was responsible for all of the madness on the plane. The Gatewatch attempted to repeat their plan from Zendikar, but this Titan proved to be too powerful, and they quickly lost control of the situation. So rather than bind Emrakul to Innistrad so she could be destroyed, Nissa drew what meager mana she could from the plane and used it to place her sigil on the moon. Now the big twist was Emrakul wanted this to happen and was influencing Tamiyo and the Gatewatch members, but that is a story for another time. With Emrakul effectively defeated, the group turned their attention to their next adventure, this time on the Aetherpunk world of Kaladesh. Aside from her retcon, this was probably the biggest singular point of growth for Nissa's character, for a couple of reasons. First, the events on Kaladesh pretty much all took place in one big city, and prior to coming here, the Gatewatch had been stationed on Ravnica, another giant city. Nissa has always felt uncomfortable in urban settings. She feels cut off from nature. She finds the densely packed buildings to be loud and overwhelming, and she struggles to ground herself when surrounded by so much artifice. On Kaladesh, that starts to change, especially when she meets the Aetherborn known as Yahenni, who explains nature still exists in a big city. It's just in a form Nissa has never experienced before, thanks to her sheltered life on Zendikar. So this kind of opens Nissa's eyes, and she starts to understand and even appreciate the beating heart that makes up a metropolis like Girapur. The other major development for Nissa comes in the form of, you guessed it, her interaction with Chandra. The two attempt to rescue Chandra's mother at one point and fall into a trap themselves, along with a non-planeswalker ally. So Chandra and Nissa could have planeswalked out of the trap, but Chandra does not want to abandon Ms. Pashiri, and Nissa admits she does not want to leave Chandra. Which means, when confronted with death, Chandra and Nissa decided to share their fate together rather than run and live without each other. You hear me, Kelman? I said they couldn't bear the thought of living without each other. So anyway, they get out of that trap without anyone dying and go on to save the day on Kaladesh, which gives us Nissa Vital Force. Notice she's now able to turn your lands into 5/5 elementals, which is the biggest she's ever done. And her ultimate lets you draw a card whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. You should file that one away up here in your gray matter for a minute, okay? So Nissa leaves Kaladesh feeling pretty good. She has grown closer to her Gatewatch companions, especially Chandra, and she has learned to be at peace within a large city. Her abilities seem to keep getting stronger, and she's using them to do some genuine good around the multiverse. Which of course means it's time to knock her down a peg. That brings us to Amonkhet, where the Gatewatch planned to attack Nicol Bolas before he could enact his evil, mustache-twirling plan to rule the multiverse. While studying the city of Nakdamun, Nissa found herself entering the Trial of Knowledge, as hosted by Kefnet. This is where she learns how to apply thought and reason to a situation, rather than relying on her more primal instincts the way she had been doing her whole life. And that's why her card from this set is the one that includes blue mana. It's supposed to represent her passing the trial and, to quote the story, stop being a mere piece on the chessboard and instead become the hand that moves the pieces. But if you remember, we already saw her heading down this path on Kaladesh, where she learned to be more accepting of constructed cities, and drawing cards is often themed as gaining knowledge, which means her ultimate was already leaning blue. So I know people were surprised to see a non-mono green Nissa, but if you were following the story, it was a justified move for the character. Now, unfortunately, a lot of her new wisdom still came too late, as the Gatewatch was no match for Nicol Bolas and was soundly defeated during the Hour of Devastation. Nissa and everyone but Jace retreated to Dominaria, where she confronted Liliana, who she believed had been manipulating the Gatewatch to suit her own needs. Liliana couldn't really deny it because she had been using her own friends to help her kill the demons that were part of her contract with Nicol Bolas, and that did not sit well with Nissa. So she declared she wanted nothing to do with the Gatewatch and headed back to Zendikar, where she thought her time would be better spent helping her home plane recover from the damage done by the Eldrazi invasion. There is no Nissa Planeswalker card for Dominaria, but she was featured in the Story Spotlight card, Broken Bond, illustrated by my favorite artist, Ryan Yee. So I'm just going to put that one up on screen for a little while here. Nissa wouldn't show up again until War of the Spark, when the signal from the interplanar beacon drew her to Ravnica and right into the trap set by Nicol Bolas. Nissa did put her Animist powers to good use during the fight against the Eternal Army. She brought Vitu-Ghazi to life and used it to topple a statue of Nicol Bolas, which was wonderful for morale, but only a mild inconvenience for the Elder Dragon. The Great Tree was no match for the God Eternals, however, and the members of the Selesnya Guild had to watch in horror as their favorite landmark was turned into matchsticks. Nissa got to make amends later by pulling together the ley lines of Ravnica and helping the guild leaders perform the ritual that would pass the powers of the living guild pact over to the reborn Niv Mizzet, and my spell check was just one long squiggly red line on that one. Nissa, of course, survived the War of the Spark and was present for the celebration after Bolas was defeated. Once again, riding that emotional high of saving the world from certain destruction, her and Chandra shared a very tender moment and expressed their feelings for one another. Are you getting all this, Kelman? They saved the world together, at least twice. Alas, Chandra would later declare that she was only interested in big burly men like Gideon, and the Gruul friends would be no more. Nissa, who shakes the world, would, however, stand the test of time. It would dominate Standard and be remembered as the best version of the Planeswalker the game has ever seen. And now Nissa comes full circle, returning to her home in Zendikar Rising to stand against Nahiri and her plan to silence the Royal and sterilize the landscape. I cover all of that in another video, so go check it out if you haven't already, but for today I will just point out the newest version of Nissa now has a landfall ability, which in a way is another callback to her Vital Force card. I also want to stress that her adding black to her color identity does not make her evil. It just changes the way that she can solve problems. Before, she was more likely to yield to others, but now she's more likely to act in her own best interest. It just so happens that her own interests this time were protecting the wilds of Zendikar. But where is she going next? To answer that, we first have to look at the big two. Longtime fans of the series know that my favorite way to evaluate a character is to ask two questions. What does this person want? What are they willing to do to get it? At the moment, Nissa wants to explore the flourishing Zendikar and continue to serve as its protector. But beyond that, she is still a member of the Gatewatch after renewing her vows during the War of the Spark. So we can take that to mean she wants to help other planes enjoy the same peace and prosperity she just brought to her home. Now, the next interplanar threat to address is probably the Phyrexians, but I don't expect to see them in the story until 2022 at the earliest. I think Nissa will be absent until then, and that's why they gave us Vivian and Garrick in the meantime. As our green planeswalker, though, Nissa will be key in facing the Phyrexians. Green is the color of accepting one's place within the world. It is the color that believes you cannot change your own nature. This is directly opposed to blue, which believes everyone is a blank slate and can become anything they want through practice and study, or through artifice. The Phyrexians are blue and black at their core, and I know with Mirrodin they have reached all 5 colors, but they're still cemented in knowledge over death. And what do you know, Nissa has experience in both of those colors while still holding their enemy position. I think this means when the time comes, it's Nissa who will be instrumental in understanding the Phyrexians and then defeating them. She will be the one to restore things to their natural order. Nissa's journey has been remarkable, especially when you consider it started off with a really bad first step. Fortunately, they were able to reel her back in and turn her into an inspirational character that has really grown over the years. She started off as a timid elf haunted by nightmares brought about by the presence of the Eldrazi. She tried to fix things on her own, only to make them worse by releasing the greatest threat the multiverse has ever known. She stood her ground and made new friends as she fought to protect the land that she loved, and she earned the title of World Waker as Ashaya and other elementals came to her aid. She saved her home and others, and unlocked mysteries of the multiverse while learning a little about herself along the way. She's held the power of whole worlds in her hand, she has breathed new life into existence, and she has made Chandra sweat. All of these help make Nissa one of my favorite characters in Magic, and I hope she sticks around for a long time. Of course, this leaves us with just one question. Which actress would best portray the Vastwood Seer in a live-action Magic movie? I'm sure some of you are already screaming at the screen it should be Yolandi after she was the inspiration for the World Waker card, but after listening to her talk for like a minute, I don't think that's going to work. My pick is Haley Steinfeld. She's a very accomplished young actress, and I think she has the right mix of quirky outsider and down-to-earth elf next door that the part really needs. And if you're having trouble visualizing it, here, let me help you. Not bad, right? Which Nissa card is your favorite? Let me know down in the comments, and then make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the great stories you'll only find here on Magic Arcanum. We'll see ya!